Oklahoma Bridges here, and this is part 2 of the Japanese short drop octagon clock. And let's take a closer look at this movement and the way it's built, because I kind of find this rather fascinating. This seems like what could almost be seen as the final step in the evolution of American clock movement design, because it's essentially a copy of an American-style clock movement with a lot of features that were seen in American-made clock movements such as this that were creeping into designs back in the 30s. More stampings used for the different levers instead of them being wires. The movement feet, the way they're made, just the overall construction of the movement. Definitely shows a copying of American movement practice with some rather interesting refinements too. Instead of the post that the suspension spring hangs on just being a slot and then a little piece of wire going through the end of the suspension spring, this actually has a brass block crimped into the end of it, like you'd see on a lot of the German-made clocks, and this fits in to the posts there. And of course, the pendulum rod itself is constructed like a lot of American clock movements from before the Depression would have been built, with the little hoop here to clear the center post. And instead of a hook on the end, there's this nice little T-bar made out of brass that the pendulum bob has a hook shaped like this that hooks over it. So a few nice little refinements that just make it a little nicer. So I just wanted to share that. I thought that was interesting. Also, in common with a lot of American clock movements, although it was very common to have just a piece of brass hitting the gong, it was also common for clocks to use a small leather insert in the end of the hammer to hit the gong, giving more of a mellow, sort of bell-like sound. Anyway, enough of these comparisons. Let's take a look at what's going on here. And I think the first thing I'm going to want to do is get rid of this correction wire, because it is freakishly long and does make looking at what's going on a little bit on the difficult side here. And this movement was a bit on the difficult side to get out of the case because of the I'm using a pair of pliers that are really too big for the job here, and so of course I'm having a little bit of difficulty. And I might want to remove this bracket here to get this out of the way. Make it a little bit easier. There we go. We'll put that on at the end of the process. Now, here's something that's interesting. As you know, most of these clocks have just a simple loop end. Well, it's got this little spacer piece that mounts under the pillar nut there to keep the loop in the correct place on the pillar instead of letting it walk up and down. So that's kind of an interesting little touch. Put the pillar nut back on. Finger tight for now, so we'll have to eventually take this apart. Move the pendulum rod and strike wire out of the way. Now I can handle the movement a little bit easier and not have to worry about that long rod getting messed up. And interesting springs with this little ridge down the middle. That's an interesting touch. Here's the escapement. Instead of the traditional pallet sort of resembling a bent staple, we have a type of pallet that was frequently used later on even on American-made clocks, where it's still a stamping, but it's a flat piece that has two pallets formed by being bent at right angles, and then as you can see, the ends are ground with a slight bevel in them to get the correct shape to the pallet there. And then of course the whole thing is mounted between the plates and mounted on these movable cocks here for adjusting the escapement. So the first thing that's going to need to be done to take this apart is going to be to try to get this spring to hook back on the hook, if it will, if it's not broken. And then I can use a mainspring winder to wind the spring up and put a clamp on it, even though the click is broken. I can still wind it up. This one's going to be fairly easy to do. And I've got the correct number 7 size winding key here now to wind it. And I think, keeping my hand clear over here on this side, I think the time side is fine. Now, the safest way to do this, if you're messing with a clock where you're unsure of the condition of the clicks and everything, and you don't feel like breaking a thumb or a finger, would really be use a letdown key to wind it. Because if something happens, well, you've got control of it still. You've got that letdown key. So I'm kind of playing with fire here a little bit, just using a regular old winding key to wind this up. But I think that the see if I can get this to flutter a little bit here. And I don't think so. This is a semi-deadbeat escapement, so it's not going to flutter. If it was a recoil escapement, it would sit there and go back and forth on its own with sufficient power. Odd shape to the way these springs are made. So anyway, I'm going to cut the video off at this point, and I'll go get the mainspring winder and a little clamp-on bench vise, and we'll see if we can get this spring to hook back on the center so we can wind it up to put a clamp on it. Else, we're going to be taking this movement apart with this spring sort of fighting us, which is no big deal. Would definitely be a pain in the butt trying to put the movement back together with the spring like this, where you're having to fight the tension of the spring to keep these arbors from popping out of place. Anyway, this is Oklahoma Bridges. Thank you for watching. If you're enjoying this, join me on part 3. Thank you.